I feel as if I've walked into the wrong room. Thank you, Christina. That was very, very kind. Thank you for coming along on a Wednesday. It is Wednesday, isn't it? On a Wednesday afternoon. I don't know how long I've got. I mean, to talk. I mean, left of life. I don't know how long I've got to talk, but I think about an hour. Yeah. Is that okay? And then we'll maybe have a chance to have a bit of conversation or whatever. The slides that I have here, I'll leave them with Christina and Loredana, and if anyone is interested in them, you're very welcome to get it set. That's my email address there as well, so that if there are issues that I raise that you think you might want to discuss or debate, whatever, then please email me, and you're very welcome to do that. Alternatively, as we're talking now, don't think of this as a stand-up lecture. Think of it as, hopefully, an encounter where we can exchange some ideas or questions or whatever. So do feel free to stick up your hand and ask questions if you feel that there are things you'd like to deepen our discussion of or whatever. I apologise for my Irish accent. I'm not sure if any of you have heard it very often. Where's the Belfast guy? You need to practice a little bit more. I'll try and speak slowly. Somebody once said that the Irish speak very, very fast because we can't wait to hear what we're going to say next. I'll try not to speed up too much. Just as a broad title, translation in terms of reflection, refraction, and performance. And I really wanted to use this almost as a way into thinking about translation. Brilliant Italian translator at Paris 3, the Sorbonne, Paris 3, Jean-Charles Vaillant. He has a lovely definition of translation where he calls it my Eurydice. And here's a picture, painting by Corot, not of somebody arriving at a party on a Saturday night with a very large carryout, but Orpheus leading his wife Eurydice out of the underworld under strict instructions that if he looks back at her, she'll turn into a pillar of salt. And it's a beautiful metaphor for translation, because the backward gaze in translation, the staring at the text, the obsessive working with the text, all that it gives us as a prize is possibly a pillar of salt, something that lacks life. And that's really the theme of what I want to talk about today. Is that legible in this slide? This is from The Guardian quite recently, and Andrew Hayden, who's a theatre critic. The article is called European Theatre Still Foreign to Us. For a very long time I was convinced that Brecht's Baal was a play about a terrible poet, because I'd only read English translations of the poems that Brecht gives as anti-hero. I was surprised when a German friend explained that Baal's poetry was beautiful in German. She then played me a recording of some, and you could immediately hear it was gorgeous in the original language. To translate for meaning inevitably loses all the poetry, but it also loses the cultural context that makes sense of this poetry. This small example starts to demonstrate the problem of foreign plays and translation. Now, we all know that. We could have told this guy that. And yet, this is an article in The Guardian by a leading theatre critic who's only just discovering, it seems, that the translator exists in a dialectical relationship with the original text. And it's a dialectical relationship that draws in its own set of particular problems. But at least there's a consciousness beginning to stir that translation is actually more complex than what people expect from the process itself. And we can go right back to the 1950s. And this is William Becker writing about French plays in performance on Broadway. And he's making almost exactly the same point. Between true translation and true adaptation, there falls most of what passes on Broadway for American versions of foreign plays. And it's in this murky area where there are no real disciplines that most translations go wrong. It is the province of, for translation, people who aim for faithfulness but miss the point. And in terms of adaptation, people who would like to adapt but lack a sufficiently potent artistic individuality of their own. So what's the point of doing a translation that doesn't work on stage? So translators very often realise they have to adapt. They've got to use some of the tricks of the trade. They've got to use the same sort of devices that rhetoricians use to make their rhetoric work. But when we start using those devices, we're also calling attention to the failures of translation. It's no wonder we're anxiety-ridden as a group of people. And it's perhaps only when we really begin to acknowledge the impossibilities of translation that we can actually really begin to translate. What Becker seems to be suggesting is two different approaches to text, and a subject to and an aloof from. Subject to the text on the page and producing a translation of it. The sort of translation that Andrew Hayden now realises has given him a false impression of Brecht's play Baal. Or you can choose to adapt the play and, like Orpheus, you turn your back on the original play and you gaze resolutely forward so that your eyes are on the negotiations ahead, the frontiers to be crossed. Is that what we think we're doing as translators? We're either translating a text or we're turning our back on it to make sure it works in performance. Well, to some extent, this is the only translation theorist I am going to mention here, to some extent, this fits in with Larry Venuti's distinction that he draws between the instrumental model of translation and the hermeneutic model of translation. The instrumental model of translation gives us a metonymic representation of something, where the active representation gives us, apparently, something which simply stands for the original. It's bound to the original through a notional paradigm of sameness. And in this instrumental model, translation appears to sit at one end of a spectrum of process. Unlike adaptation, its goal is fidelity. It's got a prescriptive, almost Neoplatonic discourse, which expresses the values of the mirror, in which success is measured by the limpid reflective relationship that's achieved, notionally, between the target and the source texts. And of course, Venuti is saying, it doesn't work. You can't actually do that, because you don't achieve, certainly not in the complex world of theatre translation and of playwriting, you don't achieve a limpid reflective relationship between target and source texts. In other words, if you follow this process, you produce what Tom Stoppard, the brilliant English dramatist, calls translations that are as scrupulous as ledgers. In other words, you account for everything in the original text as though you were some lawyer of language, as though you were some accountant of meaning. Translations that are as much fun on stage, are as dramatic in performance as telephone directories, as accountants' ledgers. And as an example, if you want to see somebody who has moved away from this scrupulous ledger-like translating, his translation of Nestroy's play, which I've forgotten its name in German, but anyway, Nestroy was a 19th century Viennese playwright, and Stoppard has done a wonderful, language-rich, dazzling piece of translation called On the Razzle. If you're looking for a PhD project, you could compare it to Thornton Wilder's The Merchant of Yonkers. There are two very different versions of Nestroy's original play, but Stoppard's On the Razzle has been translated back into German, because it works so well on stage. So the hermeneutic model doesn't give us a metonymic representation of the object that we're interested in. Instead, it encourages us to open up a metaphorical representation of it. At the other extreme of this process, adaptation is held to be free. Its methods and justification are frequently articulated through the playful terms of a refractive postmodernism. So translation, in its metonymical pursuit of textual accuracy, respects the inviolability of authorial hierarchy. Adaptation insists on extending the metaphorical sweep of the original work, and is very often seen by people who know the original play as bumming a ride on top of it, as being as not being respectful, as being irreverent. And I suppose what I'm saying to you is, as translators, we need to be reverent, but we also need to be irreverent. And what I want to talk about today is how we can balance reverence and irreverence. Because there's no point translating because we translate very often what we love, what we think will work in a way. And that means that we have some sort of respectful relationship with the original, but we need to make it work as well. So that's the horns of the dilemma that I really want to present before you today. And in a sense, what might a metaphorical extension of the play that I'm interested in be? Because what we're talking about is writing a translation. This is why, again, why translators are anxious. Writing a translation into a possibility of form, a mere possibility of language. Plays in, I think, in the British or the English-speaking world anyway, are generally performed because they're different from each other. It's quite the opposite with films. Films are made because they reflect each other. Films very often seem to come out of a mould. But plays are always different from each other, making theatre in different ways. So the translator always needs to be aware that we're translating plays to be possible. We're not translating the reality of the original play. We are translating into something that's possibly new. So where do we translate from? Let's just pick up this idea of the hermeneutic model. Does everyone know what I mean by hermeneutics? Everyone all right with that? So, if we have a hermeneutic model, where do we stand vis-a-vis the text? What's our relationship with it? And I just thought of 4 different hermeneutic positions and this is a piece of gross simplification, and I'll sue the university if they include this bit in the film. So it's a gross simplification, but it'll give you some idea of different hermeneutic stances, different positions vis-a-vis the text. Schleiermacher, for example, I'm sure you all know Schleiermacher, and Schleiermacher, the German linguist philosopher of the early 19th century, says that our understanding of a text comes from our analysis of its context. We analyse the context, and that's what gives us it's on that relationship that we begin to translate. Heidegger, in the 20th century, brings in the idea of 4 structures of understanding. In other words, we have predetermined interests which dictate our points of entry. Feminism, eroticism, they can be laudable or not laudable points of entry. Our interest in power, our interest in the impact of money. But these 4 structures of understanding dictate our point of entry and how we will deal with a text. Gadamer, more recently, talks about the contextualized self in conversation with the text. How the contextualized self brings a hermeneutic circle to the text. Where you very often see this is in academic translators. They approach the text secure within their own professional standing as a professor of Spanish, as a professor of French. And if I'm a professor of French, I've got a right to translate this play. And I will translate it from the status of my academic standing. And in other words, what Gadamer's talking about is the translator who is secure in their own mind, who's secure in their own approach to the play. They stand outside the play. They bring their own history to the play, to the text, and this is what Gadamer calls the effective history of the relationship between the translator and the text itself. The interesting thing about Schleiermacher, Heidegger and Gadamer is that they all have a Cartesian sense of the complete mind, of the mind-body binary. And the complete mind comes to the text. And I wonder, is there any point in translating something as a piece of literature that actually doesn't change you, in a way? And I sort of come out with Paul Ricoeur. And I think if you're really interested in translation and the ideas about translation, Ricoeur's work over the last, I suppose, 40 years or so has been extraordinary in terms of teasing out the meanings of what translation is, what it can be, and how we might think about translation. In this essay, Ricoeur talks about what we might call not the complete mind, the complete self. He talks about the self as incomplete. He talks about the self as composed of a series of narrative identities, which is completed in every encounter. Completed through encounter with a text, completed through encounter with a person. And that completion lasts for as little or as long as it lasts, until the next encounter, till the next text. What Ricoeur says is, it's Proust who says in À la Recherche that the reader is the reader of himself when he reads a book. So in fact, I am taught by the work of art to read myself in terms of the work of art. This is linked to a conviction of mine that I'm not an ego which is finished. I'm an unfinished ego. And therefore what I call myself, the self of myself, is in fact the pupil of all the works of art, works of literature, works of culture which I read, which I loved, which I understood. There is no ego ready-made before reading. The act of reading creates a new ego. I receive a self through the act of reading. I'm really interested in this because I think what translation shows us is what it exposes more than anything, any other form that I know, is instability. Instability of meaning, instability of text. I think it was Kierkegaard who said, we live forwards but understand backwards. And if you think about how a text moves through time and space, it accrues its meanings, it accrues its potentials for being, for relatedness, as it keeps on moving. It's not a dead object, it's still alive. No matter when the text was written, no matter where, it's still alive or potentially alive in our experience. Just as Eurydice is potentially alive in Orpheus's experience until he makes that fatal backward gaze, until he looks back too much at the text. We're unstable, unfinished creatures. You know, I'm the David Johnson who's going to win the Nobel Prize in 2 years' time. No, I'm not. I'm the David Johnson that one of you is going to push under a bus when we leave this room. Who knows? Who knows who I am? Who knows what we are? We are the species that conquered the stars. We're not. We're the species that blew up the planet. We're unfinished business. Everything is unfinished business. And that's why I come to Ricoeur, because Ricoeur is savagely, gloriously aware of the potential of the unfinished, and that we can bring completion. Not completion in any teleological sense of finite completion, but completion as a temporary staging post. The idea of translation as a refraction, therefore, in other words, we take the text, we take what we can of that text and we make it work. But there's also elements of that text that we can't reflect anymore. Why? Because a text that comes to us in a foreign language, from a foreign time, a foreign place, is full of absence. It's full of things that we cannot work with in our own language. Therefore, we need to find ways of dealing with those absences metaphorically, through our own being. We channel them through our... Doug Robinson talks a lot about the translator as a spirit channeler. And I think that's a very evocative way of thinking about these things. And it's a very Rickerian way of thinking about these things, where we channel the possibilities of newness. It was Ezra Pound who talked about making it new, and we channel those possibilities of newness through the metaphorical prism of the hermeneutic model. We refract them. We still have this moment. The text is still got this brilliant light. We simply can't reflect it. We refract it into our experience. It hits us. And as translators, we can only write from our own experience. We are the writers of our experience of a text. The idea that this idea of Benjamin, therefore, from the task of the translator, he also picks it up in this wonderful quotation which comes from his letters. Translation passes through continua of transformation, not abstract ideas of identity and similarity. He's inviting us to move away from notional paradigms of sameness and to begin to look at a translated text as having undergone journeys in which it has been constantly refracted across different cultures, different languages. Afterlife is the refraction of light in this working of Benjamin. The interesting thing about metaphor, I don't know, there's a picture of the Globe Theatre, I don't know what that's in there, but it's good. So if you get bored with the words, you can look at the pictures. Metaphor is really an interesting way to think about translation. It was Aristotle who said that metaphor is the grasping of similarity between two dissimilars. The grasping of similarity between two dissimilar elements. And that's exactly what translation is doing. The English poet Charles Tomlinson defines translation and poetry together as fragments of created relation. So if you think of a translation as a fragment of created relation, it's that created relation is establishing a metaphorical link. And out of metaphor comes a force of imagination, to imagine alternatives, to imagine new things. It's what we call a heuristic force. This quotation comes from David Miles' article Metaphor and Effect. Small scale, all the principal features of the thought processes that are most significant in creativity. For the word metaphor, substitute translation. Translation shows on a small scale all the principal features of the thought processes that are most significant in creativity. The presence of productive anomalies. There's Larry Venuti's foreignization. The crossing of conceptual boundaries. In other words, new truthfulnesses. I'm not going to use the word truth, but new truthfulnesses emerging that we can validate from our own experience. The transformation of a subject within a given domain. And most importantly, the intuition of a new order at a moment of illumination. That's a beautiful definition of what a translation is. A good translation is intuits a new order, new relatedness, new possibilities of thinking about ourselves, new contacts with something outside ourselves, an embrace of beyondness at a moment of illumination. That moment where somebody recognises something about themselves in a translation. That's why I got into translation. I had my own moment of illumination in the first translation I did, which was Lorca's Blood Wedding. And it was at the Edinburgh Festival, and I thought it was for a tiny company, and it turned out it wasn't a tiny company, it was a big company. And this is why I always talk about the anxiety of being a translator, of having your head above the parapet. There were reporters and TV cameras there, and I just went to the bar. I went to the bar at the interval as well. I just kept away from everyone. And at a moment in the final scene of the play, where the two dead bodies are brought back, death refers to them because they've been stabbed. It refers to this sort of grimace of death with the bodies as with teeth like fistfuls of frozen snow. And somebody in the audience went, "Oh!" I thought, I didn't think it was the intuition of a new order at a moment of illumination, because I hadn't read David Mile at that time. But I felt something had hit home. And we have to bring translations in. All translation is an act of domestication. All translation has to be an act of domestication. Otherwise you don't touch it. You leave it in foreign language. So, what do we do with that domestication? What do we do so that it's not normalized? So that there's something new, something that moves away from language in the everyday into language that's possible. By the way, a question for you. What makes a play translatable? I'm going to have a couple of breaks for adverts and things like this. This is a little break. So I'm posing, it's like the teaser question in 9 Cats Do Countdown. What makes a play translatable? An interesting question, isn't it? Why do you decide you're going to translate a play? I think it's because you see a possibility in the metaphorical sweep of that play. The interests that play instantiates. You feel that you can bring them home in a way that they say something to the moment of performance. And performance always takes place within the here and the now of an audience. Because an audience is always engaged in an act of presence. So the translation is always judged, always experienced, always gauged in the present moment. There's no past or future for the translation or for the play. It is rigorously present. It's one of the interesting things about theatre and that sort of translation. So, how do we bring the play home? That's Hermes, by the way. Not people going out for it on Saturday night in Belfast. Again, recur. And recur, so recur is now taking on Schleiermacher. And because one thing kills translation, and that is the context of the original. Context of the original is deadening for translation. It's the context of the new which matters much, much more. This is what Recur says. The text career escapes the finite horizon lived by its author. The author is in a Barthesian sense literally dead now. What the text means now matters more than what the author meant when they wrote it. And this is a fascinating essay because Recur debates issues of the authentic and how we authenticate and how we, much more important word, how we validate. And it makes for a very, very interesting discussion on anyone who's interested in performance theory, on anyone who's interested in how we judge the validity of a translation. It's a very, very big question. So, what Recur is saying is a text doesn't have a fixed, finite range of meanings. It creates and accrues to itself as it moves through time and space all sorts of different potentials for hitting meaning. If you have a look at the book Moving Target on theatre translation, that's exactly what the title of the book is saying. Does anyone recognise this man? One of the great writers of the 20th century? Borges, the Argentine writer. And Borges says very simply, the original is unfaithful to the translation. And he talks about this. He's got a wonderful story called Pierre Menard, author of The Quixote. And Pierre Menard wants to be the author of Don Quixote, Don Quixote. And so he decides he's going to translate the book into New Spanish. And he translates it into New Spanish and he's finished. It's identical to the old one. Word for word, comma for comma, paragraph for paragraph, his work is entirely unchanged. And yet Borges says it's a better Quixote than the original. It's a better Quixote than the original because so much has happened since that it has new potential for meaning within it. In exactly the same way, I don't know if you've been following this whole thing at the moment about Hogarth, Shakespeare, where they are, for 2016, which is the fourth centenary of Shakespeare's death, they're asking a number of leading writers to do retranslations of Shakespeare's work. And the English novelist Howard Jacobson has decided he's going to do The Merchant of Venice. And there's a wonderful interview with him, I think in The Independent, where he talks about Mr. Shakespeare had never met a Jew. He'd never heard of the Holocaust. But we can't, as we translate, and as we experience texts, we can't excise these things from us. They are part and parcel of who we are. So when I come to look at The Merchant of Venice, says Howard Jacobson, I have to look at it with all of that accreted baggage. So in other words, we can't simply duplicate reality. Reality duplicated isn't real. Because reality is something, if we follow, in other words, there's no metonymic equivalent of reality. If we follow the hermeneutic model, reality is constituted by our interpretations of its various signs and signifiers and symbols and so on. Here's our second break. Short story by Borges. We all read Spanish? Yeah? No? I didn't think everyone would read Spanish. Okay, so you're going to have to trust me translating this. Here, this is a short story about reality duplicated is not real. In that empire, the capital letters, by the way, are Borges' original ones there. They're interestingly random. In that empire, the art of map making achieved such perfection that the map of a single province occupied a whole city, and the map of the empire occupied a whole province. As time passed, these huge maps no longer satisfied people. And the College of Cartographers, the College of Mapmakers, created a map of the empire, which was the same size as the empire, and coincided point by point with the empire. Less addicted to the study of cartography, the generations to come began to realise that that huge map was useless. And not without irreverence, they flung it into the inclemency of the sun and of the winter. In the deserts of the West, there are still ruined fragments of the map that shelter animals and beggars. But in all the rest of the country, there's no other relic of the discipline of geography. In other words, reality duplicated isn't real. Maps, the map is not the territory. Maps are symbolic representations. And in fact, many maps have almost like a topographic relationship with what they're showing. Think, for example, of the map of the metro, not the metro, the underground in London. It's not a physical representation of the relationship on the ground between stations. It's a metaphorical capturing of that relationship. But we as translators are mappers. So we're mapping not the territory of the original, we're mapping our relatedness between the text and our own context. And this leads me to this sort of provisional conclusion. Translation is about refusing. Translation refuses the discursive authority of the source text and the target context. And it achieves this by both establishing and working within the provisionality of the different spatial and temporal domains inhabited by text and translator alike. We're caught in movement. Translation is an itinerary. It's not a fixed position. We translate in movement. Translation is a mobile practice. We're constantly moving between text and our context, rather than fixing on one or the other. Both translation and adaptation, in this sense, become poles at the end of the spectrum that are meaningless. What we do is actually much more mobile and more complex. If you're interested in the idea of translation as an itinerary, the person you should look at is an anthropologist called James Clifford. And Clifford talks a lot about locations of translation. And it's interesting it comes from an anthropologist. Okay, earlier on, I don't know if you know Slavoj Zizek. I think he's Slovenian, a Slovenian philosopher, writer. And he talks a lot about translation, as most philosophers do, without ever mentioning the word. Because translation, did somebody write a book called Translation Changes Everything? It's true, isn't it? Translation is at the heart of everything. It's a process that you can't ignore. And in this case, Zizek is talking about Hollywood movies. The most succinct definition of historicism is historicity minus the unhistorical kernel of the real. And the function of the nostalgic image is precisely to fill out the empty space of this exclusion, the blind spot of historicism. What this is getting at is the absent in texts, the absent because it's closed off to us. We don't understand it. We can't simply reflect it. This is the unhistorical kernel of the real, the human. What is absent very often from the texts that we translate? What is often very absent in the translations of those texts is the human real. The translation of the words is there, the translation of the movements, but the human real is very often missing. Let me give you an example. Oh, there's another advert. Everyone recognize the picture? Paul Klee. So, in other words, when we find something that we can't simply reflect, there's a dot of a light there. We've got to take that dot for a walk. As writers, as translator writers, or translator adapters, we take this dot of light for a walk in the way in which Klee builds up his pictures. We can think of this in a less aesthetic way. We can think of it more in terms of encounter, in the way that John Dewey talks about art as experience. And he says, in experience, flow is from something to something. We can't recreate the human of a text unless the somethingness of the translator, the materiality of the translator, the physical, bodily, emotional, affective, cognitive presence of the translator is there. It's not a question of visibility or invisibility. It's a question of an act of presence. And the translator has to be there as the somethingness that transmits the text. In other words, It's a synaptic connection. I'm going to skip on this because that would get too complicated. Let me move on to this. So, has anyone come across this? It's a book. It doesn't look like a book. It looks like a box. It's a book by the American poet Anne Carson. And it's entitled Nox, which is the Latin for night. And when you open the box, the book comes out concertina style. The pages come out concertina style. And what Nox is, it's a translation of a poem that most people have, a lot of people have tried to translate, and nobody has really done a translation where people are going, wow, that's it. It's a poem by an old Latin writer, Catullus, and it's Catullus 101, very well known poem. It's the poem where Catullus' brother has died, and he's going back to the funeral. Multas per gentes et multa per aequor vectus. It starts off. It's one that everyone has learnt at school. So in this concertina, on one side she recounts the research that she did into Catullus' poem. On the other side, she recounts her personal reaction to it, her personal story of the poem. So it becomes like a translator diary. But it comes like a translator diary in which the metonymical and the metaphorical are side by side. It echoes what W.B. Yeats said about the creation of poetry. Poetry is where passion and precision have been one. The precision that comes from what we know about the text. We can't abandon that text. We can't abandon that knowledge. We're translators. But at the same time, that text hits our own story. And by hitting our own story, we make something new out of it. We don't displace the original text. The original text is still there. But we make something new out of it. This is Catullus 101. And it's these lines in particular. Nunc tamen interea haec prisco quae more parentum, which refers to very complex funereal rites in ancient Rome. So one translation deals with it as, now in the meantime, nevertheless, these things which in the ancient custom of ancestors are handed over. Another translation at this point, now though even these which from antiquity and in the custom of our parents have been handed down, and it doesn't do it. The poem doesn't live on the page. It simply doesn't do it. And Anne Carson approaches this poem with the same anxiety of the translator. She says, I'm not going to get this to work. And then, just as she's reading about Catullus going back to see his dead brother, knowing that all he's going to find is the ash of his dead brother, and that he'll have to talk to this ash, he'll have to undergo the whole funereal rites, the rites of getting to know again. She discovers she's got a brother. She comes from one of these obviously Irish-linked families with secret brothers and sisters all around the place, and she's got a secret brother. And she's amazed. And she discovers as she's working on the translation, just as she's about to go and see him, he lives in Copenhagen apparently, but he's just died. And the poem really comes home, and at that point, she can translate it. Many of the peoples, many of the oceans I crossed, I arrive at these poor brother burials. This is an almost literal account of the Latin. Advenio has miseras frater ad inferias. But she's captured something there. She's captured the bewilderment of grief. She's captured the breakdown of language that comes from grief. It's a translation, but it also captures something new for us. So I could give you the last gift, ode to death, and talk why with mute ash. Now that fortune tore you from me, you, O poor wrongly brother, wrongly taken from me, now still anyway this, what a distant mood of parents. That's how she copes with those lines. She's adapted those lines. She's refracted those lines into her own experience. and she's captured something very, very deep about the original poem. Handed down as the sad gift for burials accept, soaked with tears of a brother, and into forever, brother, farewell and farewell. It's a translation, but it's a translation which is refracted through, in this case, the extraordinary experience of the translator. But all of us have these extraordinary experiences. And our extraordinary experiences are important prisms when it comes to the text that we've chosen. There's a text. Now, at this point, this is where Ricoeur's validation comes in, because we need to validate those experiences. We can't be totally subjective. If you're interested in the dangers of subjectivity, Umberto Eco has got a brilliant book called The Limits of, is it The Limits of Interpretation? The Limits of Interpretation, where he talks about how far one can go in these things. The example, what I'm using is the idea of validation. And what I mean by validation is there is something in the text that your own experience enables you to validate as truthful. To validate and to find an expression for that act of validation. How am I doing with time, Christina?
You still have about 10, 15 minutes?
10? Okay, I'll take it. Okay. This is the play that's actually on tonight over in the college. This is from a production that was done at the Trafalgar Studios a little while back. And it's set, the play is known in Spanish as Los Locos de Valencia, the mad people of Valencia, madness in Valencia. And this character, played by Lawrence Fuller, is the keeper of the madhouse. So obviously, now in Lope's world, he's not mad. But in my world, he became mad. So what does that tell you about me? I don't know. So I'm getting confessional here. He only has one speech in the whole play. And his problem is, he is an ordinary man in his 50s, and he falls in love with this young girl. And the problem is, she's one of the mad women in the asylum. And you can't fall in love with the mad, because the mad are potentially devoid of a soul. The mad, you can't fall in love with them because they don't have the gaze which allows you to access to their soul in the whole courtly tradition. So he's really confused by the fact that he's fallen in love with this mad woman. In fact, she's not mad. She's run away from her parents who wanted to force her into a marriage, and she's been set upon by her servant, almost raped, and she goes into the madhouse to get out of trouble. So this is Pisano's speech. And this is a literal of it. I am not frightened that this mad woman should have enamoured a madman, but a sane man is no small thing. As she comes to provoke his soul, because of her my brain is more changeable than a windmill. Oh love, if you're such foolishness, how are you a god in heaven? When the accounts and claret should entertain me, love comes and puts ribbons and a quiff on me. The weather vane is lost. You can't rely on age, for willpower is always the pimp of appetite. All in all, my passion is such, I take it to be the finest fortune. So he's saying, look at me. I should be doing the accounts. I should be sitting in front of Coronation Street with my slippers and my pipe. And here I am, seeing if my hair is okay. Do these tights really suit me? What will she think of me wearing this? And I'll sort of prance around in front of her and hope she notices me. What am I doing? But God, this is brilliant. It's great to be in love. Something's happened in my life at last. Okay, that little routine begins to establish something of the human kernel that Zizek is talking about, this unhistorical kernel. I identify with this. I imagine most of us have made fools of ourselves at some stage for somebody we fancy? I'm looking around the room. No, everyone's looking down. I certainly have. Come on, give us a nod of some sort. No, so I've certainly been through that experience, which isn't to say I name her or her address in the translation. Of course not. It's not subjective like that. It is an understanding of the unhistorical human kernel that allows you to write this speech. So there's the two speeches, mine and the original side by side, with colours on them, just to show you the ways in which they've reflected and refracted into each other. Mad attracts mad, natural enough, like to like. Bird brains of a feather, but she churns the brains of the same. My mind's spinning like a windmill, left standing in a hurricane. The yellow stuff just comes from this line here. At my age, nothing excited me beyond a glass of good red wine. And now I look at the mirror, I fix my hair, practice my smile, make sure my clothes are hanging well. This is the madness of seagulls, wheeling and pitching on the wind, but I have not changed it for the world. It's only one version, it's only one translation. It's not the translation, it's not the version. It is something which is partly a reflection and partly a refraction of the original. Some of it is a reflection, some of it is a refraction. And if you go through the different colours, you can see exactly how that works. I did another lope, which ran at the, what's it called? Theatre Royal in Bath. And then did a bit of a tour. It was La Dama Boba, which we could never agree on a title for. La Dama Boba means in Spanish the silly lady, and it was performed under one name and published under another because the theatre and I just couldn't agree on the title. These are clips. These are photographs from the production. In it. It's actually based on an old Commedia dell'arte story. In it, there are two sisters. One is stupid, and one is very clever. The stupid one is the one the family want to get married off, so they give her the dowry. So the boyfriend of the intelligent sister runs off with the stupid sister for the dowry. I'm starting to get bored already. But what really interested me about this play was that intelligence and stupidity could be ways of women presenting themselves so as to protect themselves in a male-dominated society, early 17th century Spain. These were techniques. Stupidity and intelligence became like a carapace, a hard-coated exterior in which to protect themselves. That began to interest me a little bit more in terms of how I began to refract the play into my own experience. And there was evidence in the play for it. A couple of tiny little lines, but there was enough evidence. Because Lope, as a playwright, was passionate. It wasn't that Lope was a feminist, but Lope loved actors, and he loved the fact that women had to pretend so often in his society. And I think women still do have to pretend in all sorts of ways. And that brought something home to me. But in this little clip, in this little excerpt, the intelligent sister she's been away for a couple of days, she comes back, and her boyfriend has gone off with the stupid sister. And the stupid sister is starting to get intelligent as she falls in love. Because as she enters a different sort of security, she can start allowing herself to be herself. So two different translations. Mine is on the left. She wants to show off her own intelligence. Facile, fickle, feigning fraudster. You can hear the F word. That's the unspoken element. It's playing with that. It's really saying you. Okay. So facile, fickle, feigning fraudster. You immoral, mendacious man. Men dare to call women fickle. We shift and change like weather vanes, you say. You call us mutable. So what are you? And here's the bit that I've added in. On the basis, this is a pretty literal translation, on the basis of transferring accounts. I just wanted to bring up the idea, this guy's doing this for money. Money is what drives people in this world. You cash me in. Now this is a productive anomaly, to follow on from Miles, David Miles' idea of metaphor. This is an anomaly, because banks didn't exist in the 16th century. There were no bonds or shares. So this is refracting this idea of you want her for her money. You are such a liar. That's refracting that into our own experience now. You cashed me in like you redeem a bond or sell a share. You closed my account. You switched banks in a single month of absence. Yes, with all due propriety, but you've transferred your account to the Finea, to my sister. So again, it seeks to bring something home. Whether or not it's a wholly domesticated text, I don't think it is, for a number of reasons. Finally, the same sort of idea, because I genuinely believe that the banking crisis was the largest unpunished crime of the 21st century so far. That's a view that I hold very strongly. I think it's been an unpunished crime. You can see an echo of it there. But somebody asked me to do the miser, the Belgrade in Coventry, asked me to do the miser. And I thought, the miser, at the time of recession, fabulous. How can you not talk about the banks in this? So here's a scene from the miser where Arpagon, who is the miser, is searching his servant before he leaves the room, because he's so worried his servant's going to steal stuff. So he body searches him like at an airport every time he goes out, and he says, you can't trust anyone. They're always going to steal your money. I've got my money buried in the garden. Oh, I said that. Did they hear me? And so on. So that's how it works with the comedy. And what he says is this, and you can see an insertion. Vigilance saves the day once more, but can vigilance be enough? When your servants are all jailbirds like that reprobate, you can watch, you can listen, you can sit all night and you hear the floorboards creaking, and you know someone's on the prowl. This is the torment of the rich. That'll all be taken away. We have a duty of care to our cash. And then the insert about banks. For your interest, this was done with the lyric as well. And the idea about bringing in the bank. Do you know who invented the banking system? Good King Billy. Isn't that an interesting refraction in its own way? If you put it in the bank, what happens? They lend it to somebody else, and when they decide not to pay it back, the bank folds, closes its doors, and reopens the next street down. Banks are like the wind. In the storm, only bankers pick up the windfall. Banks only work if you've no money. And as for safes, and we go back, they're worse than banks. They draw burglars like bees to money. Honey, I meant, you might as well put up a sign, money in house, please help yourself. And so it goes on. In the way that Molière gives his characters comic routines to go through. So, once again, it's a refraction. It's a refraction of a concern about money into the imperative of our concept, of our context. But it's not a refraction that does away with the sense of the play as a translation as well. It becomes two things simultaneously. It's a hybrid form. And in fact, when we staged this play, we used to lose a lot of audience right at the start, because the play opened with a French song, and people thought, it's in French. And people would start leaving. And at that moment, then the lights went out. And somebody went around and begged 50p for the meter and stuff like that, and they realised that it actually wasn't going to be in French. So we're constantly playing. This is what I meant earlier on by a playful postmodernism. We're playing between reflecting and refracting. We choose to refract where we think there is a human dimension that's missing. It doesn't work. Something that we need to, as an act of translation, to write forward into the experience of our audience. But we're always writing back as well. We're also bringing our audience into something else, into an experience outside their own. And that's where something new happens. That's where there's a moment of recognition. When in the newness, in the otherness of the translation, through the processes of refraction, an audience discovers something about themselves that they can identify with, that's unexpected, that makes them go, wow, that's me. Okay, thank you very much indeed.